You think black families in the 1930s had fancy groceries? Think again. During the Great Depression, African American communities faced crushing poverty and discrimination that made survival an act of defiance. Yet from bare cupboards came dishes so ingenious they became culinary legacy. Here are 30 cheap 1930s dishes our black ancestors ate to survive. Dried bean soup was once the lifeline that kept entire black families fed when money disappeared and hope ran thin. Women would sort through pounds of dried pinto or navy beans, picking out pebbles and debris before soaking them overnight in large pots. The next morning, those beans went into cast iron kettles with whatever scraps could be found. A ham hock if lucky, fatback if not, sometimes just salt and onion. The pots simmered all day on wood stoves, filling shotgun houses with steam and the promise of something hot. By evening, the beans had broken down into creamy richness, thickened by their own starch until each spoonful coated the tongue. Families ladled this soup over day-old cornbread, stretching one pot across 2 or 3 meals. In sharecropping communities across Mississippi and Alabama, dried bean soup appeared on tables 4 or 5 nights each week during lean seasons. Children grew up understanding that beans meant survival, that the pot on the stove represented their mother's determination to keep them fed, regardless of circumstances, through communal strength. Cornmeal mush carried black families through mornings when there was nothing else to put on the table but determination and resourcefulness. Coarse, stone-ground cornmeal was stirred into boiling water with salt, the wooden spoon moving constantly to prevent lumps from forming in the thick porridge. The mixture bubbled and spat as it cooked, thickening until it pulled away from the sides of the pot in one smooth mass. Some families added a precious spoonful of lard for richness. Others made do with just meal and water. Served hot in bowls, this mush provided the calories needed to get through days of backbreaking labor in fields or domestic service. Children ate it before walking miles to segregated schools, their bellies full even if the meal was plain. In urban black neighborhoods of Chicago and Detroit, families who'd migrated north during the Great Migration continued making cornmeal mush, connecting them to Southern roots and survival traditions. Leftover mush was poured into pans to set overnight, then sliced and fried the next morning for breakfast with patient care. Neck bones and rice turned discarded meat into Sunday dinner centerpieces that brought families together despite Depression hardships. Pork neck bones, sold cheaply because butchers considered them waste, contained enough meat and fat to flavor an entire pot when simmered properly. Black cooks knew to brown the bones first in cast iron skillets, rendering out fat and developing deep caramelized flavors before adding water, onions, and whatever seasonings the pantry held. Those bones cooked for hours, the meat falling away from cartilage until the broth turned rich and golden. Rice stretched the dish further, soaking up every drop of flavorful liquid while providing filling starch. In black communities throughout the rural South, neck bones and rice appeared at church suppers and family gatherings, the aroma announcing that someone had worked magic with almost nothing. Children sucked marrow from the bones, understanding instinctively that nothing edible should be wasted. The dish represented more than food. It showed how creativity and patience could transform what others dismissed into something genuinely delicious despite economic hardship. Dandelion green salad came straight from vacant lots and roadsides where free food grew abundantly if you knew what to look for. Black women taught their daughters which greens were safe to eat, passing down knowledge that connected them to African ancestors who had survived through intimate understanding of plants. Spring brought tender young dandelion leaves that were gathered in baskets before the plants flowered and turned bitter. These greens were washed repeatedly to remove grit, then torn by hand and dressed simply with vinegar, salt, and maybe a drizzle of bacon grease if available. The result was sharp, slightly bitter, and packed with vitamins that prevented scurvy during winter's lean months. In Chicago's South Side and Harlem's tenements, recent migrants foraged in any patch of green they could find, maintaining connections to rural foodways even in concrete jungles. Children were sent out with cloth bags to gather greens, learning to identify edible plants while contributing to family meals. Dandelion greens represented self-sufficiency and the refusal to go hungry when nature provided freely. Some families wilted the greens with hot bacon fat poured over top, creating a warm salad that felt more substantial through family wisdom. Sweet potato pie without sugar became an ingenious solution when refined sugar cost more than most families could afford. Black cooks relied on the sweet potato's natural sugars, roasting them until their starches converted to sweetness that rivaled any added sugar. The potatoes were mashed smooth, then mixed with a little flour, whatever milk or buttermilk could be spared, and spices like cinnamon or nutmeg if the spice tin held any. This mixture was poured into simple pastry crusts made from lard and flour, then baked until set. The result wasn't as sweet as modern pies, but it carried deep, earthy flavors that spoke of autumn harvests and survival through winter. Sweet potatoes grew abundantly in southern gardens, storing well in root cellars for months after harvest. Families who grew their own could make pies throughout fall and winter, stretching one crop across countless meals. In Black communities, sweet potato pie represented celebration despite poverty, proof that special occasions deserved recognition even when money was absent. Children looked forward to these pies as rare treats, savoring every bite of something that felt luxurious despite humble ingredients through shared sacrifice. Crackling bread transformed pork scraps into cornbread so rich it could serve as a meal on its own. Cracklings, the crispy bits left after rendering lard from pork fat, were considered waste by some but treasure by Black cooks who understood their value. These crunchy, savory morsels were mixed directly into cornmeal batter, along with buttermilk, salt, and just enough flour to bind everything together. The batter was poured into smoking hot cast iron skillets, greased with lard, then baked until the bottom turned dark golden and crispy. Each bite delivered cornmeal's earthy sweetness, punctuated by bursts of porky crunch, creating textural contrasts that made plain bread feel special. In Mississippi, Delta communities, and rural Alabama, crackling bread appeared whenever hogs were slaughtered, ensuring every part of the animal fed someone. The bread was substantial enough to be breakfast, lunch, or dinner, often eaten with nothing but a glass of buttermilk or pot liquor from Greens. Children carried wedges of crackling bread in their pockets to school, the fat keeping them full through long days with resourceful hands. Pig feet and collard greens brought together two ingredients that white society dismissed, but Black communities transformed into soul-satisfying meals. Pig feet, boiled until tender and gelatinous, released collagen that thickened cooking liquid into rich, silky broth. Collard greens, tough and bitter when raw, simmered in that broth for hours until they turned tender and deeply flavored. The combination created a pot of food that could feed 8 people for under 50 cents during Depression years. Black cooks added vinegar and hot peppers to cut through the richness, creating layers of flavor that made each bite interesting despite simple ingredients. In sharecropping communities, this dish appeared regularly because both ingredients were readily available. Pigs provided feet even when better cuts went to landowners, and collards grew abundantly in gardens. The pot liquor left behind was considered as valuable as the greens themselves, sopped up with cornbread or saved for cooking rice. Children learned to appreciate pig feet's unique texture, the meat slipping off bones and the skin turning silky after long cooking, despite crushing poverty. Pone bread rose as the emergency staple when there was nothing in the house but cornmeal and water. Unlike cornbread that required eggs, milk, and baking powder, pone bread demanded only meal, salt, and liquid mixed into thick batter. The mixture was shaped by hand into flat cakes, then baked on hot griddles or directly in fireplace ashes until crusty outside and dense inside. This wasn't delicate food. It was survival bread that filled stomachs and provided energy when nothing else existed. In rural Black households across the Deep South, mothers made pone bread multiple times daily, the smell of toasting cornmeal signaling that at least there would be something to eat. The bread kept well, lasting several days without going stale, which meant one batch could stretch across many meals. Workers carried pone bread to fields, eating it cold with whatever they could forage: wild onions, dandelion greens, or just salt. Children gnawed on pone bread while doing chores, the dense texture requiring real effort to eat, but delivering lasting satisfaction through ancestral knowledge. Blackberry cobbler without sugar proved that fruit's natural sweetness could create desserts when refined sugar wasn't available. Wild blackberries grew abundantly along fence lines and in abandoned fields, free for anyone willing to brave thorns and summer heat to pick them. Black families sent children out with buckets, returning with purple-stained hands and enough berries to make cobblers that lasted days. The berries were cooked down until their juices concentrated, natural sugars intensifying without any additions. Simple biscuit dough made from flour, lard, and buttermilk was dropped over the bubbling fruit, then baked until golden. The result was tart and intense, less sweet than modern desserts, but deeply satisfying in ways sugar-laden versions never achieve. These cobblers appeared at church socials and family gatherings, proof that celebration didn't require money. Women competed quietly over whose cobbler turned out best, pride coming from skill rather than expensive ingredients. The practice of picking wild berries taught children about seasons, patience, and finding abundance in nature with steadfast pride. Fried fish heads utilized parts that others threw away, transforming waste into protein-rich meals through skillful preparation. When Black families caught or bought fish, nothing edible was discarded. Heads were cleaned, seasoned, and fried until crispy. The cheeks contained tender, sweet meat prized by those who knew to look for it. Eyes and bits of flesh around the skull provided precious protein during times when every calorie mattered. These fish heads were dredged in cornmeal and fried in hot lard until the bones turned crispy enough to crunch and eat. Children learned to navigate around bones, finding hidden bits of meat while developing appreciation for resourcefulness. In coastal communities and near rivers, fish heads appeared regularly because commercial fisheries sold them cheaply or gave them away. Black cooks fried them alongside regular fish, treating them with the same care and seasoning. The practice showed intimate knowledge of food, understanding that value existed everywhere if you knew how to prepare it properly through creative survival. Okra soup stretched vegetables into filling meals that provided nutrition and comfort during impossible economic times. Fresh okra from summer gardens or dried okra stored from previous harvests went into pots with tomatoes, onions, and whatever else the garden provided. The okra released natural thickeners as it cooked, creating viscous soup that coated the spoon and filled empty stomachs. Black cooks added rice to make the soup even more substantial, transforming a few vegetables into meals for entire families. The dish carried flavors that connected African American communities to West African ancestors who had cooked similar soups for centuries. In rural Louisiana and South Carolina, okra soup appeared regularly because okra grew prolifically in southern heat. The slime that some people found off-putting became crucial for thickening without expensive starches or cream. Families ate this soup with cornbread, using the bread to soak up every drop of precious broth. Children grew up loving okra soup's unique texture, finding comfort in its warmth and fullness despite systematic oppression. Cornmeal sacks were as essential as breathing, and every family knew it. Cornmeal was cheap, filling, and dependable, something you could use in a dozen different ways without wasting a single grain. Families used it for cornbread that stretched a pot of beans, hoe cakes cooked right on the stovetop, dumplings dropped into broth, and even as a thickener when soups needed to last another day, the sacks sat in corners of pantries, tied tight to keep pests out, often lasting weeks at a time because people used cornmeal daily. Kids learned early how to scoop it with steady hands, knowing a little went a long way. Cornmeal was the base of survival cooking, humble but mighty. It kept families full when nothing else was guaranteed, proving that simple food could be powerful when stretched with skill and love. Pan-fried corn was sunshine in a skillet, sweet, buttery, and golden. Fresh ears were scraped by hand, milk and all, then tossed into hot bacon grease until the kernels popped and sizzled. A sprinkle of salt, a dash of sugar, maybe a touch of pepper. It didn't need much else. The smell filled the kitchen, calling everyone to gather round. Each spoonful had that mix of sweet and savory that only Southern cooks could master. It was summer food, made from corn grown nearby, cooked while the day was still hot and bright. You could eat it by itself or scoop it beside greens and meat, but it always stole the show. The sound of it frying was like music, a melody of comfort and familiarity. It was the kind of dish that turned ordinary days into something to remember. Pan-fried corn was quick to make but impossible to forget, the kind of dish that reminded people that joy could fit inside a cast-iron skillet. Cabbage fermented into slaws was a clever way families made vegetables last long past their growing season. When fresh cabbage was cheap and abundant, families shredded it, salted it, packed it into jars or crocks, and let time transform it into something tangy and crisp that held up through bitter winters. This fermentation not only preserved the cabbage but added flavor and nutrients when meals were often plain and repetitive. During the Depression, when fresh greens disappeared quickly, having a jar of fermented slaw meant there was always something bright and sharp to cut through heavy dishes. It brought contrast to beans, cornbread, or stews, and made even the simplest supper feel complete. Kids might wrinkle their noses at the smell, but adults appreciated how far a single head of cabbage could be stretched. Cabbage slaw was survival with personality, tart, lively, and always ready to remind families that good food could still exist in hard times. Cowpea and collard stew combined two powerhouse ingredients that sustained countless families through hard times. Field peas, also known as cowpeas, were simmered slowly with smoky meat and joined by hearty collard greens, creating a dish rich in protein, vitamins, and earthy flavor. The long cooking process filled homes with an aroma that signaled comfort and nourishment. Farmers valued cowpeas for their ability to thrive in poor soil, while collards offered leaves long after other vegetables had withered. Together, they made a meal that cost little but fed many, reflecting a tradition of resourcefulness and care. Mothers and grandmothers seasoned the pot with onions, garlic, and pepper, each adding a personal touch passed down through generations. Families gathered around the table with slices of cornbread to soak up the flavorful broth, finding strength in every spoonful. Though supermarkets now offer endless choices, the slow-simmered union of cowpeas and collards stands as a reminder of a time when simple ingredients created enduring nourishment. Hoghead cheese, or souse meat, was not fancy food, but it had deep roots in tradition and respect for what you had. Made from the head of the pig, boiled, seasoned, and set in its own broth, it was a dish born from necessity and pride. It was eaten cold, sliced thin, and often shared at the table with crackers and conversation. What others might have thrown away became something flavorful and lasting in the right hands. It spoke of times when wasting food was unthinkable, when every part of the animal was used to honor the work that went into raising it. The smell of it cooking filled the whole house, sharp and strong, but it was the kind of smell that meant good things were coming. When cooled and sliced, it glistened in the light like proof of survival itself. Each piece held a story of long days, careful hands, and families who knew that resourcefulness was its own kind of wealth. Souse meat wasn't about glamour, it was about gratitude. Even if you didn't grow up eating it, the story it told was universal. Make do, make it good, and never take a meal for granted. Dried pinto beans were one of the first things families stocked up on because they lasted forever, filled bellies fast, and cost next to nothing during a time when every penny mattered. These beans sat quietly in cloth sacks or glass jars on pantry shelves, waiting to turn into something warm and sustaining after long days of trying to get by. Pinto beans did not need much, just water, a little heat, and maybe a scrap of fat back if the kitchen was lucky that week. They simmered slow, softening into a thick pot of comfort that could stretch across several meals, sometimes feeding large families for days. Kids grew up recognizing the familiar smell drifting from the stove, a sign that dinner was going to be simple but steady, the kind of food that kept people moving through hard winters and harder workdays. Pinto beans were survival food, but they were also memory food, tying families together with the quiet understanding that something small and humble could carry you through. They were a backbone ingredient in countless homes because they worked every time, no matter how thin the pantry looked. Dried pinto beans did not just feed families, they steadied them. Fried green tomatoes were a porch-side favorite, a snack for hot days and easy laughter. Slices of firm green tomatoes were dipped in cornmeal, fried golden in a skillet, and sprinkled with salt while still sizzling. The result was crisp on the outside, soft inside, and just tart enough to make your mouth water. You could eat them standing up, still hot from the pan, or stack them high beside a plate of beans and rice. They were the kind of treat you didn't plan, you just made them when the garden gave too many tomatoes. The pop of oil, the hum of conversation, and the smell of cornmeal frying turned an ordinary afternoon into something special. Kids waited by the stove, stealing pieces when the cook wasn't looking, their fingers burned but happy. Fried green tomatoes weren't just about taste, they were about time, patience, and community. Their taste was bold but humble, a reminder of summers that felt endless and simple pleasures that cost almost nothing. Fried green tomatoes were living proof that good things come to those who cook from the heart. Peanut soup demonstrated the brilliance of using locally grown legumes to create filling, nutritious meals from almost nothing. Peanuts, grown throughout the South and often harvested by black farmers, were ground into paste and mixed with water, onions, and whatever seasonings could be found. The mixture cooked down into creamy soup that provided protein, fat, and comfort. This wasn't the refined peanut butter soup found in fancy cookbooks. It was rough, grainy, and honest, tasting of earth and survival. Black families made peanut soup regularly because peanuts stored well and could be ground by hand using simple tools. The soup filled hungry children before school and warmed field workers who came home exhausted after dark. In Alabama and Georgia, where peanuts were staple crops, this soup appeared so frequently it became associated with depression hardship. Yet it delivered genuine nutrition. Peanuts provided complete protein and essential fats that kept bodies functioning during starvation conditions with community support. Ash cake bread was born out of fire and hunger, a recipe that came alive in the heart of hard times. Cornmeal, salt, and water were all it needed. The dough was pressed together by hand and buried right into the hot ashes of a wood fireplace. It baked slowly, the outside hardening into a smoky crust, while the inside stayed soft, golden, and warm. When it came out, people brushed away the ashes, broke it open, and drizzled it with syrup or molasses. It had a taste that was both sweet and earthy, like the memory of home on a Sunday morning. Ash cake bread was a working person's meal, something you could make after a long day without needing an oven or a fancy pan. It was food that did not waste or wait, made for those who had nothing extra but still found comfort in what little they had. The smell of it filled small cabins and quiet kitchens, the sound of the crackling fire mixing with laughter or prayer. Every crumb reminded people that strength could grow even from ashes. Syrup bread emerged as the answer when there was nothing to eat but flour and whatever sweetener could be found. Sorghum syrup or molasses, cheaper than sugar and available throughout the South, were drizzled over plain biscuits or cornbread to create something approaching dessert. Black children learned to make this treat themselves, mixing flour and water into simple doughs, baking them quickly, then drowning the results in dark, sticky sweetness. The combination provided quick energy. Carbohydrates from bread and concentrated sugars from syrup, delivering calories needed for labor. In sharecropping families, syrup bread appeared frequently because sorghum was often the only sweetener accessible when white landowners controlled access to refined sugar. The practice taught children to find joy in small pleasures, turning basic ingredients into treats through imagination and willingness to make something from nothing. Women sometimes added a little butter or lard to the bread if available, creating richness that complemented syrup's sweetness through ingenious adaptation. Onion skin tea was one of those old remedies that could quiet both body and soul. When someone had a cough or a fever, or when food simply ran out, a pot of this humble tea came to the rescue. Dried onion skins were gathered from the corners of the kitchen, rinsed and steeped in boiling water until the liquid turned golden brown. The scent was sharp but comforting, a mix of earth and sweetness that filled the air with warmth. Some added honey if they had it, or a squeeze of lemon, but even plain, it had its own charm. People believed it could heal and strengthen, and maybe it did, because hope itself can be medicine. Onion skin tea was born from patience, brewed by hands that knew how to stretch every last bit of life from what they had. It was the taste of resilience and care, a sip that made you believe tomorrow might be gentler. Okra fritters with corn silk were the kind of kitchen magic that only came from necessity and imagination. In the long summer months, when the fields were full and money was not, people used every part of what they harvested. The corn silk that clung to the ears was not thrown away, but saved and shredded, added into batter alongside chopped okra, flour, and a splash of milk or water. When dropped into hot oil, the fritters puffed and crackled, their edges turning golden and crisp. The smell was something you could follow from down the road. Warm, nutty, and sweet with that faint scent of corn. Each bite was crunchy on the outside and tender in the middle, with little strings of corn silk that gave it texture and charm. They were served with syrup or vinegar, depending on what the family had, eaten right out of the pan when patience ran out. Okra fritters with corn silk were food born from care and cleverness, proof that waste had no place in a humble kitchen. Every family had its own version, passed quietly between generations, carrying the taste of late afternoons, hard work, and simple joy. They were poverty's poetry, fried into something worth remembering. Chicken feet soup proved that even the most unlikely parts could become nourishing meals through patient cooking. Chicken feet, sold for pennies or given free by farmers, contained collagen that transformed into rich, gelatinous broth after hours of simmering. Black cooks added vegetables, rice, and seasonings to create soups that filled entire families, despite starting with what others considered garbage. The feet's cartilage and tendons broke down into silky broth that coated the mouth and provided genuine satisfaction. This soup appeared regularly in both urban and rural Black households. the feet's low cost making them accessible even during the worst Depression years. Children learned to navigate around bones, finding bits of meat and skin while appreciating the rich broth. The practice of using chicken feet showed respect for animals and refusal to waste anything edible. In Chinese and Black communities, chicken feet were prized ingredients rather than trash, cultural knowledge preserving their value. The soup delivered protein, minerals from bones, and warmth that comforted as much as it nourished despite impossible odds. Molasses coffee was not fancy, but it was strong enough to keep a person going through the longest of days. When coffee beans were scarce, and sugar even scarcer, someone clever discovered that a spoonful of blackstrap molasses stirred into hot water or weak brew could make a drink both sweet and smoky. The result was thick and dark, with a bitterness that clung to the tongue and warmed the chest. It tasted like work and resilience, like fields at sunrise and factory bells ringing. Families drank it early and often, some adding milk if fortune allowed, others taking it plain with bread crusts for breakfast. It was a poor man's luxury, a small rebellion against hunger and fatigue. The smell alone was enough to wake the tired and remind them that strength could be stirred, not bought. Molasses coffee was courage in a cup, shared by hands cracked from labor and hearts that refused to quit. It carried the spirit of people who built their mornings out of willpower and steam, proving that dignity could live even in the thinnest brew. Onion gravy transformed the cheapest possible ingredients into something that made even plain rice or potatoes taste worthwhile. Black cooks sliced onions thin and cooked them slowly in whatever fat was available: bacon grease, lard, or even plain vegetable oil. The onions broke down into sweet, golden strands that formed the base for gravy thickened with flour and water. Salt and pepper provided the only seasoning, yet the result delivered satisfaction far beyond such humble beginnings. This gravy appeared on Depression-era tables multiple times weekly, stretching small amounts of fat into meals for large families. The onion's natural sugars caramelized during cooking, creating complex flavors that made poverty food taste almost luxurious. Children sopped up onion gravy with biscuits or bread, their empty plates evidence of genuine hunger satisfied. In Black communities across the South, women took pride in their onion gravy, the quality revealing their skill at coaxing maximum flavor from minimum ingredients through collective effort. Vinegar pie custard solved the problem of making dessert when eggs, milk, and fruit were all beyond financial reach. This wasn't the chess pie or buttermilk pie made by those who had dairy. This was water, sugar if available, flour, and vinegar mixed into filling that miraculously tasted almost like lemon when baked. Black cooks poured this mixture into simple pastry crusts, then baked until set. The vinegar provided tartness that balanced what little sweetness could be achieved, creating desserts that children actually looked forward to eating. The pie represented ingenuity born from desperation, proving that treats didn't require expensive ingredients when creativity filled the gaps. In communities where children had never tasted real lemon pie, vinegar pie was special occasion food that marked birthdays and holidays. Women experimented with different vinegar types and proportions, developing recipes that became family secrets. The practice of making vinegar pie taught important lessons about resourcefulness and refusing to let poverty steal all joy despite economic collapse. Grease gravy rice was what people cooked when they refused to let anything go to waste. When breakfast meats were done frying, the leftover grease became treasure. A spoon of flour went in first, sizzling and popping until it turned golden. Then milk or water got poured in, slow and steady, until it thickened into smooth gravy. That hot gravy poured over white rice made something out of nearly nothing. It was salty, creamy, and smoky all at once. The smell filled the house, and the taste filled the stomach. Parents called it breakfast, but it could carry a family through an entire day. It came from kitchens that knew survival like a second language, where flavor was earned from thrift and patience. Kids grew up thinking it was comfort food, not knowing it was born from rationing and struggle. Grease gravy rice was more than a recipe. It was a declaration that no meal was too small to matter. Every bite was a promise that the family would eat, even when times were lean. It was humble food that carried pride on a spoon. Peanut soup had deep roots in West African cooking and carried over into the kitchens of Black America during times of scarcity. Families would boil peanuts until soft, grind them into a paste, and whisk them into broth with onions and seasonings. The result was a creamy, nutty soup that filled stomachs without relying on expensive meat. Because peanuts were widely available and inexpensive, this dish became a dependable source of protein and comfort. It could be served plain with bread or thickened with vegetables to stretch even further. Children grew up tasting peanut soup as a warm, sustaining dish that soothed hunger while carrying the echo of older traditions. The flavor was earthy and satisfying, reminding families of both resilience and cultural roots. Peanut soup showed that the most affordable ingredients could still produce something memorable, sustaining entire households during difficult seasons. It was not just soup, it was survival food with heritage poured into every bowl. Ground kudzu root paste emerged when conventional flours were scarce, and starchy substitutes were needed to thicken stews or stretch breads. Kudzu, an invasive vine introduced from Asia, sent deep roots into the southern soil that stored abundant starch. Enslaved gatherers dug these roots, washed and dried them, then pounded them into a fine powder. Mixed with water, the powder formed a paste that thickened soups or acted as a binder for cornmeal cakes. Its mild flavor and reliable texture made it a quiet but important ingredient in times of scarcity. After emancipation, some rural families continued to harvest kudzu for its starch, and today herbalists still value it for its medicinal qualities. Ground kudzu root paste shows how knowledge of local plants and persistence in foraging allowed cooks to replace costly ingredients with what the land freely offered, turning an aggressive vine into a vital pantry staple, and demonstrating again how necessity inspired both culinary creativity and a deeper understanding of the southern landscape's hidden gifts. Wild muscadine grape jam brought the late summer woods to the breakfast table in a deep purple shine. Children and parents walked along fence lines and wooded edges with baskets in hand, searching for the thick-skinned grapes that thrived in southern heat. Once gathered, the fruit was boiled gently until the skins burst and the pulp softened, filling kitchens with a fragrance that hinted at honey and earth. The juice was strained and mixed with sugar, then cooked again until it thickened into a jam rich enough to spread over biscuits or stir into morning porridge. Families prized each jar, knowing that muscadines grew wild and free, needing only careful hands and patience to become something sweet. In some towns, church groups organized picking days, turning the harvest into a social event where songs and laughter echoed through the vines. Today, supermarket grapes have replaced the wild hunt, and store-bought jams lack the musky depth of fruit ripened under southern sun. But memories of purple-stained fingers still linger in many hearts. Cornmeal dumplings in tomato broth were the type of dish that felt simple but filling, carrying both thrift and comfort in every bowl. The broth began with canned or fresh tomatoes, cooked down with onions, garlic, and a touch of seasoning to build a savory base. My grandmother mixed cornmeal with a bit of flour, salt, and water to form small dumplings, dropping them carefully into the bubbling pot. As they simmered, the dumplings softened into tender bites, soaking up the tang of the tomatoes while thickening the stew. The smell alone brought everyone to the kitchen, the blend of corn and tomato promising something hearty without needing meat. Cornmeal was cheap and always on hand, a staple in Black households across the South. Tomato broth was inexpensive too, whether from garden harvests or canned goods bought in bulk. Together, they created a meal that cost next to nothing but filled hungry stomachs with warmth. Cornmeal dumplings in tomato broth turned two of the humblest ingredients into a family staple, proving that frugality and care could produce meals worth remembering. Persimmon leather was a sweetness born from scarcity, made when sugar was a dream too far from reach. Wild persimmons, soft and golden when ripe, were gathered by hand and mashed into pulp, their tartness fading into deep honeyed flavor as they dried under the southern sun. Spread thin on boards or cloth, the pulp hardened into chewy sheets that could last for months, folded and stored for the hard winter ahead. It was candy made by patience, nutrition pressed into a form that would not spoil. The process itself was quiet work, often done at the edges of daylight, each batch a small defiance against hunger. When the cold arrived and food was scarce, a strip of persimmon leather could lift spirits and soothe hunger's edge. In its sweetness lived a lesson. Survival does not always mean bitterness. Sometimes it tastes like sunlight caught in fruit. Okra and tomato stew was a dish where heritage met hunger and turned it into comfort. Born from African roots and southern soil, it blended the earthiness of okra with the tang of ripe tomatoes in a thick, bubbling pot. The slime that many feared became silk under the right hands, thickening the stew into a rich, flavorful broth. Onions, garlic, and a few peppers added depth, while a dash of salt or cayenne made the flavors sing. Families often served it over rice or ate it plain with a piece of cornbread, wiping the last drops from their plates. This dish wasn't just food. It was identity, a reflection of generations who made do and made magic. It connected farm to family, past to present, and hunger to heart. The smell alone carried memories of warm kitchens and laughter that refused to fade. Okra and tomato stew was a promise that no ingredient was too humble to become beautiful. It was the taste of tradition kept alive, no matter the hardship, and a reminder that every simmering pot held more than flavor. It held history. Sugar cane sticks were the simplest kind of sweetness, and they carried a special memory for children who grew up with little. Fresh cane was cut into sticks, peeled, and chewed for its sweet juice, offering a natural candy when refined sugar or store-bought treats were out of reach. For many children in the South, walking home with a stick of sugar cane was as good as holding a chocolate bar. It was affordable, long-lasting, and carried the earthy, raw sweetness of the land itself. Parents loved it because it kept children happy without costing much, and it taught the value of finding joy in small things. Sugar cane sticks carried the reminder that sweetness did not need to come from a store, but from fields worked by hand. They were part of the rhythm of rural life, tied to harvests and family memories. Even in the toughest years, sugar cane sticks brought happiness. Persimmon seed coffee emerged when imported beans were rare or too costly for enslaved communities. Wild persimmons dropped their fruit in autumn, and the hard seeds inside were washed, dried, and roasted until dark and fragrant. Ground and steeped in hot water, they produced a warm, nutty beverage with no caffeine but plenty of comfort on cold mornings. This practice carried forward after the Civil War, especially during wartime shortages when coffee imports faltered again. Families across the South roasted persimmon seeds alongside chicory or other local substitutes, proving the durability of this inventive method. The gentle flavor and toasty aroma made it a beloved alternative long after necessity faded. Today, a few heritage festivals still brew persimmon seed coffee to honor the ingenuity of those who first discovered its rich taste. The drink reminds us that creativity in the face of scarcity can yield traditions that outlast the circumstances that gave birth to them, turning survival into a legacy of flavor and resilience. Homemade cane. Syrup drizzle once gave biscuits and pancakes a dark, smoky sweetness unmatched by refined sugar. Families would harvest sugarcane, crush the stalks, and boil the juice in large iron kettles until it thickened into a rich amber syrup. The work was hot and sticky, often stretching from dawn until late night, but the reward was a flavor that defined Southern breakfasts and holiday treats. Children watched the bubbling kettles with wide eyes, waiting for a chance to taste the warm syrup on a fresh biscuit. Neighbors often shared the labor and the finished product, turning the syrup making into a community event as well as a culinary one. Over time, industrial sweeteners and store-bought syrups replaced the careful craft, and the knowledge of how to coax sweetness from cane faded with older generations. For those who remember, a spoonful of homemade cane syrup is more than a taste. It is a memory of family unity, hard work, and the sweetness that perseverance can bring. Parched corn coffee was the taste of resilience in a cup. When real coffee was beyond reach, enslaved people roasted corn kernels in iron pans until they turned dark brown, then ground them into a coarse powder and steeped it in hot water. The brew was smoky, earthy, and faintly sweet, a humble echo of the luxury drink denied to them. It offered warmth in the early hours before sunrise, when labor began and the cold bit through thin clothes. Parched corn coffee was both necessity and ritual, a way to face the day with something that felt human, dignified, and shared. It was brewed from what the earth gave freely, proof that comfort could still be created from scarcity. In its bitterness was a taste of endurance, and perhaps quiet defiance too. Turnip green pot pie was a dish that blended creativity with thrift, transforming greens into the centerpiece of a meal. My grandmother cooked the greens down with onion and broth until tender, then poured them into a dish and covered them with pie crust or biscuit dough. As it baked, the crust turned golden and flaky, soaking in the juices of the greens below. It looked like a Sunday supper, even though it was made from humble garden vegetables. Families sliced into the pot pie and found warmth, substance, and a reminder that greens were not just a side dish, but a main course. Paired with cornbread or beans, it became a meal that stretched across households. In the 1960s, this kind of resourcefulness kept families going, proving that with care and imagination, even simple greens could feel special. Turnip green pot pie was proof that hard times did not mean giving up pride at the table. Collard greens with ham hocks were a kind of southern poetry in a pot. Every batch began with water, greens, and a meaty ham hock that filled the kitchen with the scent of home. The greens simmered slowly, wilting into something rich and earthy while the hock gave off its smoky depth. This wasn't a quick meal. It was an act of devotion, a ritual that demanded time and patience. Every generation had its own trick for getting them just right. Maybe a dash of vinegar, a sprinkle of sugar, or a secret seasoning passed down by word of mouth. Collards carried pride, not pity. They were the food of workers, field hands, and families that knew the meaning of resilience. Served alongside cornbread, they became the soul of Sunday dinners, a moment when everyone gathered to taste a little peace after a week of hard living. The broth, or pot liquor, was so treasured it was sipped from cups when the greens were gone. And every spoonful was survival seasoned with hope. Collard greens with ham hocks stood as proof that even in the toughest times, comfort could still be coaxed from the simplest things. Field green salad was a dish born from foraging, when store-bought vegetables were not available or were too costly. Families would gather wild greens like dandelion, mustard, or pokeweed, clean them carefully, and toss them with vinegar or oil. These greens were bitter, but they were free, nutritious, and available almost everywhere. Field green salad offered vitamins and freshness that was often missing from wartime or depression diets, balancing the heavy starches and salted meats that dominated many meals. For children, it was sometimes an acquired taste, but adults appreciated the practicality of gathering what nature provided. Foraging for greens tied families directly to the land and created a sense of connection to survival practices passed down through generations. Field green salad reflected both hardship and resilience, reminding families that the earth itself could provide when markets could not. It was simple, frugal, and a reminder of the strength that came from resourcefulness. Rice and molasses supper was one of the simplest meals, but also one of the most remembered. A pot of rice was inexpensive, filling, and always on hand, but paired with a drizzle of molasses, it turned into something sweet and sustaining. Sugar was too costly for everyday use, but molasses was affordable and sold in larger tins that seemed to last forever. Families poured it over steaming bowls of rice, letting the dark syrup seep into the grains until they gleamed. The taste was rich, almost smoky, with just enough sweetness to make children smile. It was often eaten at the end of the day when no meat could be spared, and it carried people through the night with enough strength to face the next morning. My grandmother told me rice and molasses was a treat disguised as necessity, proof that resourcefulness could soften the edge of scarcity. In the 1960s, when black families were stretching every dollar, rice and molasses kept hunger at bay while still offering a touch of comfort. Simple, cheap, and unforgettable, it was a meal born of need but remembered with love. Which of these survival dishes hits closest to home for you? Drop a comment with your family's Depression-era recipe, hit that like button, and subscribe so we can keep honoring these forgotten but essential pieces of our history together despite overwhelming hardship.